Thank you, Kris. Thank you for joining us for a discussion among several Indigenous scholars and social workers on decolonizing pathways towards integrative healing and social work. My name is Rupaleen Bhuyan. I'm associate professor in the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work in the University of Toronto. Reflecting, moving into today, I was thinking about my parents who are Ahomia and originate in the land of the Brahmaputra River, which is at the foothills of the Himalayas, and who migrated and settled in St. Louis, which is at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. My own upbringing there was not fully engaged with the many Indigenous peoples that call that territory their home: the Osage, the Sioux, the Sauk, the Haudenosaunee. Although I did have opportunities to learn about the ancient civilization of the Cahokia. Now, as a settler and working at the University of Toronto into Toronto, I'm grateful to acknowledge that this territory has been the traditional lands of many Indigenous peoples, including the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun and Wendat communities. I'm also, as a settler, mindful of and seeking to understand my own responsibility to the territory, keeping in mind the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, the agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabem's people to care for and peaceably share this territory, and the treaty with the Mississaugas of the Credit River on this territory. I'm also grateful to be co-hosting today with my colleague, Ashley Quinn, who I will bring into our conversation and invite you to say hello.
Ojo, Kajakwe and Dishnikas, Washashabi and Dodam, Mississauga and Dunjaba. My spirit name is Glowing Ember Woman. My given name is Ashley Quinn, and I am part of the Martin clan, and I'm of Ojibwe and Irish ancestry. Right now, I'm calling in from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Qualicum First Nation, which is on the northern edge of Vancouver Island. Humbly am grateful to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. So Ashley and I will play the co-host role today. So at this time, I'm playing the Zoom person. So Ashley, I'm gonna take your image away if that's okay, and then invite Professor Jane Middelton-Moz. So honored that you could join us today. Jane is a fellow colleague here at the University of Toronto, assistant professor in the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. Jane has been central to creating the MSW Indigenous Trauma and Resilience field of study at the University of Toronto, where she teaches intensive courses on trauma and resiliency. She brings over 50 years of experience in consultation, training, community intervention to address multi-generational grief, trauma-informed care, and create positive workplaces, environments, and community interventions. As a faculty member, I'm personally very grateful for the lessons Jane shares with our faculty to inform social work education, and especially in this year of the pandemic where there's so much heightened uncertainty and many of the wounds people are carrying are especially raw. The need to create spaces where people can heal from grief and trauma, but also to honor the capacity for folks to adjust, to adapt, and especially for Indigenous teachings and practices to facilitate healing. So I invite you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rupaleen. It's my honor and privilege to be asked to welcome all of you to this webinar, to provide some welcoming remarks, and to share a bit about the Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency field of study at the Factor-Inwentash School of Social Work at the University of Toronto. I want to sincerely thank Rupaleen and Ashley and express my gratitude to them for the time and effort it took to bring all of us together today. It was indeed an effort, and I know how much work they put into it. It's been my experience that social work students bring integrity, humanity, and a desire to provide the very best in working with Indigenous communities. Coming from a wide variety of cultural backgrounds, future community workers require a foundation of cultural competency and trauma-informed knowledge of the critical issues facing Indigenous people in communities and urban centers today. Identifying and appreciating the incredible resiliency of Indigenous people and cultures throughout the world is essential for this critical work. It is exciting that universities throughout Turtle Island are beginning to address the need for this important specialized education and beginning to change the face of social work. As one of the ITR graduates has said, and I love this, Indigenous education is more than indigenizing a curriculum. It does not attempt to change a pyramid into a circle, but rather it proposes bringing the circle in its entirety to a field of study. A circle that is built on the foundation of the Indigenous values of kindness, respect, inclusion, belonging, and honesty. Standing within this sacred circle is critical to the work that all of us do. I am forever grateful that the University of Toronto and the faculty at the Factor-Inwentash School of Social Work welcomed and honored our circle and have continually supported the ITR field of study in a good way. We understand that social work practice is more than learning research methods. It's more than learning the history of social work. It must embrace the understanding of the critical mental health issues, health inequities, lack of appropriate resources, and environmental issues facing Indigenous communities today. The importance of understanding the continuing multi-generational effects and legacies of historical trauma and genocide, domestic violence, drug addiction, sexual abuse and assault, and deaths by suicide in Indigenous communities throughout the globe. It was my honor and privilege to be an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Canada, and I have heard so many stories of so much pain in our communities. It's important for social workers to view these mental health issues in Indigenous communities through a trauma-informed lens, understanding that these effects are normal responses to abnormal and painful historical trauma and desperate attempts to survive rather than pathology. The importance of working with others with respect for all that has brought them to this place. It's a change in focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Also understanding that hurt people, and the importance of supporting communities in developing a continuum of care that provides services to assist in the healing of trauma victims and their families, and offenders and their families, in order to stop the multi-generational legacies of abuse that began with historical trauma. Social work practices must recognize the tremendous resiliency and strength of Indigenous people, which has been highlighted so clearly in this pandemic, as Indigenous people were the very first to respond effectively with concern for every community member, concern with infecting other community or family members far more than being infected oneself. The ITR focuses on the importance of preparing social workers that can work in their own communities, or understanding that when being invited to work in another community, we do so with respect and joining, never with judgment, standing with, not apart from the communities that we serve and are invited into, and always understanding that we're visitors in someone else's home. Standing with, not speaking for, attuning to and listening to what each community identifies as their strengths, their difficulties, and their solutions. Working with the community to utilize the strengths of the community to solve the problems identified by that community. Always honoring the protocols, the spiritual and cultural practices, healing wisdom and ways of knowing of that community. The importance of creating a safe environment where individual narratives can be witnessed by others, utilizing the strength of culture, the strength of storytelling, ceremony, family, and community to validate, process, integrate, and move past the effects of unresolved trauma. Cultural competence means learning the wisdom that exists within the culture. Knowledge that has been held for hundreds of years by Indigenous elders in North America and indeed Indigenous elders throughout our globe. Understanding the importance of family, extended family, and community to Indigenous people, and the importance of working with the entire family unit rather than focusing only on individual healing. The ITR is built on a foundation of Indigenous values that focus, as one of my elders called, on bridging the river. The importance of building bridges, not walls. Bridging Western methods of healing and the most current research in neuroscience, interpersonal neurobiology, and effective treatment modalities with Indigenous wisdom, knowledge, and healing practices in North America and throughout the globe. Building bridges between cultures, attuning to, truly seeing, respecting, hearing, and learning from one another without judgment, sharing with each other with kindness and respect rather than appropriating another's culture. Standing with, standing up, not speaking for another. Indigenous wisdom teaches us that each racial group has so much to teach and much to learn from one another, which is the true meaning of inclusion and belonging. Bridging the past to the present, multi-generational trauma to resiliency, lack of attachment and disconnection to assisting in rebuilding the family circle, rebuilding communities and circles of support, understanding that connection is indeed the correction. The ITR is grounded in the importance of worker wellness and recognizes that in order for social workers to be effective, they must first be well mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. That just as they say on airplanes, we must put our own oxygen masks on first before attempting to help someone else. Each learner in the ITR program develops a wellness plan in the very first intensive with 2 goals and plans in each area, as well as identified supports that will allow them to be successful in meeting their goals. Wellness plans are revised and updated every 3 months with the assistance and support of our faculty throughout the 2-year program. The ITR is proud to be one of the many fields of study developed to enhance and change the face of social work. We are now admitting learners to our 6th cohort. The ITR graduates are changing the face of social work and programs they work with, doing excellent trauma-informed and culturally relevant and respectful work, and changing organizations to healthy places that are safe for our people. We have the honor and privilege of hearing from 2 of those graduates today, Jermaine Elliott and Lisa Robinson. We have the honor and privilege of learning today about the important work of Chris Clarke and Michael Yellowbird in creating new pathways toward integrative healing in social work. Again, I look forward to learning with you today and want to welcome all of you to this incredibly important and thought-provoking webinar. Thank you so much, and please stay well and safe.
Thank you, Jane. I'm just reflecting on all the amazing complexity you shared, and even the hope and possibility, even as the heaviness of so many of the pains and harms you discussed are there, the possibility of building bridges at least gives me a sense of hope. So thank you very much. So listening actually to Jane earlier, I was reflecting on my own journey into social work before I started my social work degree, which was at the University of Washington in Seattle. I had been working on the Navajo Nation, and I had this very visceral memory of sitting around the kitchen table. I was working at a domestic violence organization, and we spent a lot of hours eating sunflower seeds. And I'm pretty sure that's an Indigenous practice. And it was a way, I think, to support each other because the work was really hard, and also make light. So we mostly were teasing each other who could crack more seeds. And so I say that because I really want to recall how central Indigenous community and knowledge and ways have been to my own education as a settler living in the United States and now Canada. And I don't think I'm always aware of how central it has been. And so along that journey, I had a chance to meet Michael Yellowbird. We were both teaching at the University of Kansas at the time. And I've been a big fan following, Michael, your work for many years, how you've been a leader in creating spaces for Indigenous youth and teaching Indigenous knowledges in the academy, but also working with fostering Indigenous practices, recovering knowledges that have been there, but often people were not able to have deep awareness of because of the violence of colonization. And then through the publication of this book, got to know Chris Clarke, the work, and the work you all have done together in creating workshops to help people build this collective knowledge on healing. So I just wanted to invite each of you to introduce yourselves however you'd like, and also how you came to work with each other.
Well, I first just like to say thank you so much, Ruth Pauline, for organizing this and for all the participants who are here today. Thank you, Jane, for those really wonderful opening remarks, and to the opening songs. It was a beautiful opening song. I'm here located on Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba, and it's really a great place to be right now. I am actually a member of the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Wickawa. And I am a visitor to this part of the world. So although there was no border before, so our tribes were traditional horticulturalists, agriculturalist tribes, traded a lot with the Cree and the Dakotas and the Ojibwe people. All came down to our territory to purchase to our markets. We had all these markets where you mentioned sunflowers. We grew sunflowers, potatoes, all kinds of corn and beans and squash. So we traded that, and of course, people up north here bring down hides and furs and all kinds of dried moose meat, all these different kinds of things. So there was a very vibrant world that I came from at one time before colonization. So I'll just say that much as an opener, so as an introduction.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. This is kind of my first experience with Canada, so it's really nice to hear about your center. It sounds so very important, and I'm very honored to be invited here. I'm speaking to you from Finland, which the northern part of Finland is Sami territory, which stretches across Russia, what is nowadays part of Russia, Norway, and Sweden. But I'm originally from the Central Valley of California, which is the traditional homeland of the Yokut, Mono, and Dachi tribes. I'm an Irish Norwegian background. I've been an immigrant for about 20, 25 years in Finland, but I've also lived back and forth between the two countries. Sunflower seeds were a big part of my childhood as well, which is why I had to kind of pipe up about that. It was kind of a collective thing when we would go to ball games and things, that we always sat in the stands with the crowd and, enjoyed that. And those were really communal times. When I think of West Fresno, the area where my father was a football coach, where everybody, the community was very diverse, came together. And it was a really nice moment of kind of common gathering, which is that connection that we do need. So I'll stop there. I'm sure you have questions. So
Yeah. Well, reading parts of your book, I didn't get to read it. Like, I didn't get to do the old-fashioned thing where you sit and open a book, because I think I was looking at it on my computer, which is not the same. I have to get the actual book. But the way you wrote the book was a conversation between the two of you. And I'm just curious, how did you all get this started? What is this collective work? What does it look like? Because I understand you both have long commitments to wrestling with the colonial violence within social work and how to, chart a path forward. So I'm curious, where did it all start for you all?
I think it was breakfast in Vermont, actually, because I think I opened a door at a conference and kind of fell over, Michael. And I apologized and said, well, look, I'm going for breakfast. Why don't you join me? I had a rental car, and I think we ended up having breakfast for 3 hours talking about these different issues and missed a large part of the conference. But for me, it was very eye-opening, because I just want to say, having grown up as a settler in California, where I really had very minimal exposure to ideas of settler colonialism, colonizing social work was something I really had never heard about. What I had learned of colonialism was that it was something far away. It was something that the British Empire did in Africa or something like this. And yet, working in social work, my father was someone who was in an orphanage for a number of years and lived in kinship care. My family had a lot of foster kids. So we had contact with social work quite a bit. But I had very mixed feelings and sort of a distressed feeling about social work, but I had no words or understanding of why. I didn't know how to analyze it. So this first conversation for me was very important in kind of opening up a new world that I really hadn't thought about.
Yeah, that's the same story. I think what before Kris and I had met, what really informed me, as I talk about in the book, was a mentor, Ronald G. Lewis, who was the first Native professor that I had in my graduate studies. This is way back when, in the late 70s. I was doing my MSW, and he was one of my professors, and he was the first person that really introduced me to the concept of colonization in social work. In fact, he's written about it. And colonialism, just like Kris, it's kind of hidden from the American narrative and agenda. It's just something that people came and discovered this empty land, and they civilized it, and they built this civilization, right? This empire. And through manifest destiny and the help of God, this white Christian God. And so I grew up on a reservation for most of my life. And I would talk about that in the book, the things I experienced in terms of the hardship as well as the beauty and the strengths that we had on the reservation. I mean, we were at the same time going through these dramatic transformations, taking away language and culture and identity, but yet underground hanging on to a number of these kinds of things. So after I met Ron, and he was at Wounded Knee, he was also at Alcatraz Island in the late 60s. He was part of that whole movement, of AIM people, American Indian Movement people, that maybe, I don't know if young people study that enough. That's really it's really an important part of our history, where, you had the Brotherhood here in Canada with George Manuel, and it was very similar. If it wasn't for people like that, people like me would have never been in the academy, because they started these Native studies programs, and we were finally bringing Native people into social work because of all this horrendous history of removing kids and just all this policing and that was going on. So when I met Kris, we started having this conversation about this stuff, and I was kind of telling her my experience and what I had learned going through that, and we really resonated. She was very very open to that, as well as she had, if you read the book, she has her own story about being marginalized in so many different kinds of ways. So we just really hit it off, and we spoke the same language, and we were both really, I think, I guess, committed to working together in some way to kind of do to transform, social work. So we started with those kinds of ideas about what kinds of things were happening, and then it kind of, in the book, is really revealing. I think we really kind of dug into the dark side of social work and looked at that, and to kind of think, well, okay, we got into this social work, and now what, right? Years ago, I wrote a story about this, published it, but it's when Bureau of Indian Affairs social workers came to my house and removed kids. We talked about that, and I remember talking to my mother a few years ago, and she said, "Yeah, I always wondered why you ever wanted to be a social worker." She said, because of all the horrible things that had happened, to our people from social work. So Kris and I shared these stories, so that was kind of like how we start opening up this really big interest that we had together to kind of contribute, I guess, to the liberation of the truth about what social work is about, and then what potential we have people to kind of help work with others to transform. So
I'm wondering, like, that the work of the dark side of social work, I feel like we could spend hours just talking there. But in a way, I wish I would like to hear more about the practices that you uncovered or you were bringing together. In conversation with Kris, I was healing. It sounds like there are many workshops that you all co-hosted, tapping into healing practices, some of which show up in the book. What does it look like from that vantage point of bringing people together? What were the kind of lessons you learned from these healing practices? And I guess even for myself as a social work educator, where do they belong in our social work training or practice?
Well, we started having what we called like decolonizing retreats in Fresno, California, and the model of doing them was we would have no money, no grant money. We would be beholden unto nobody, and it would all be done with community, people participating. Somebody like Michael would stay at my house, and people would host other people at their homes, and someone would donate food, and we really tried to work in that way. And I think just developing that kind of a model of, people really wanted to talk about these issues, and they found no venue for this. There was no spot for this, and there was a great willingness to come together as activists, as community members, as social workers, as students. People had a great variety of roles, and we would do different things like theater of the oppressed or drumming, talking circles, different ways to get people connected. But also, I think one of the main outcomes that came from these events, and they were held, like I say, I think once a year for 5 years, was that people developed permanent ties, so that they had also support systems and people that they could go to, when they had dark times or struggles with work. So the healing practices, were maintained by people after the events, and the dialogues continued. I mean, Fresno right now is an area where there's a lot of activism, and a lot of the people who are in our workshops are really driving forces. And I think that synergy that people had in coming together, helped drive them to also, seeing beyond and getting energy from each other.
Yeah, and just to kind of, again, follow up with that, I think that was a very brilliant idea, and that was Kris's idea to hold these decolonization workshops, seminars, or retreats. because it really gave folks an opportunity to talk about, what were some of the biggest challenges in being a social worker, right? And what is the systemic racism? I mean, you're describing social work, because of everything we know is about that. And only more recently have we gotten alternatives to some of the systemic racism in social work. For example, as scholars, we're able to publish. We don't have to publish in the mainstream journals that will single you out because the ideas you have may be too radical or untested or not empirical. But you can find Indigenous journals or journals that invite this kind of dialogue and discourse. So that's one thing, right? And so we had these conversations about the academy, about the whole operation of social work, and of course into the dark past of social work. Social work is a profession that was founded under white Christian supremacy, period. And that's just what early social work was all about. It was about religious groups, about religious social organizations and clergy leaders, just like the Salvation Army. You can't have a bite until you say, you thank God for this, right? So it was just the same way of co-opting Native people into Christian religions. So it was used. So Christianity was used as a tool of oppression, and social work used that well. And so that's the whole undergirding and the subtext of social work. I mean, when you get back to Hull House, Jane Addams, that's the mother of social work. Look at Hull House and how Hull House used to prohibit Black people from being in Hull House. They couldn't be in that, unless it was all full, unless they couldn't fill it to capacity with white people. That is the most early, and of course, these are Christians, right? This is the earliest sort of level of racism that's happening in social work and in the marginalization of people. And of course, it's all been aimed at the marginalization, and it's never really been aimed at challenging white supremacy. It's been only mostly now more recently anti-racism, which is very different than white supremacy challenge, right? So just don't be racist to these people, but that's not dismantling these white racist structures, and that's what we took on in the book. We talked about how that was a huge part of that. And then in these conversations, we listened to students. And then, of course, Kris and I were talking about it late at night, at her house or over lunch or breakfast or whatever. And starting to formulate these ideas that we talk about in the book.
Yeah, and a big part of, what was important was I think for both of us, was writing it in a way that it was accessible to people and wouldn't be so difficult to, or a specialized language that it wouldn't be accessible to people, because I think we both wanted to reach out and also to reflect, as Michael said, these dialogues that we've been having with people. So the writing of it, I think we were both trying to be very conscious of being clear and open so that anybody could pick that up and find something in it, that it wasn't only going to be for a small circle of people.
Yeah, and I think Kris did a great job on the story that she did about one of the workers on the suicide hotline. I mean, if that isn't like, sweatshop labor, and abuse of social workers, I mean, you just take a look at that, how the system just sort of just saps them, uses them up until they quit because they can't go anymore, or in child welfare. I mean, these are the things that we that are pretty clear to us, that's what's happening in social work. And of course, it calls for major structural reform. So anyway, yeah. So there's a lot of stories that we have in the book. So
I have to say that my favorite story actually was your story about water, because when I first read it, I read it very superficially, and I thought, what's he on about? Like, what is this talking about? But when I read it like the second time, I mean, I think it's a very profound story. You have to take your time with it and think about it. But I think that this just reflects also the colonial mindset that is so deeply instilled from childhood in us, the white supremacist colonial mindset. is I kept expecting when I read that story that this water was going to do something. It's going to heal. Like, what's it going to do? You know, where's the data? What's the, you know, and actually what's profound about it is that sense of connection, which is something we don't learn. That's why we also started the book with talking about how are we on this earth? How do we exist here? How do we see our existence? How do we think we know things? And then how do we act? Because there is a difference, you know, and I noticed it with reading the water story, because yeah, it went over my head the first time because I wasn't used to thinking in that way. But when I read it the second time, I think to me, that's the most deeply philosophical story that really encapsulates everything, which is why it's great that it's like one of the first stories as we talk about those elements, because that's really what it's about. It's about the connection. If the water's not well, we are not well. Yeah.
It's the story, you know, is really not my story. I'm just a kind of a messenger of the story, because this is a story that many Indigenous people tell about, you know, that water is life. I mean, talk about a bit about, you know, Standing Rock, of course, in the big fight there, resistance to corporate, you know, influence in politics, you know, trying to build this pipeline and all these pipelines that are happening. And thank the Creator, there are people there that are mindful to understand that we need clean water, you know, and water is not just a commodity, but it's life, right? And so, as I told a story, one of the things was then, I go back to Ron Lewis, you know, in the parking lot at University of Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, at Helen Bader School of Social Work, out in the parking lot. So he's telling me, you're going to graduate, all this stuff, you know, and he tells me, he said, you know, Michael, he said, you go back home, he said, you can't just start another social service program and hang eagle feathers on it and call it, you know, Indigenous social work. He said, you can't just hang, you have to draw from, you know, the knowledge of your people. And so that's how the story ended, you know, kind of moved in that direction, where my aunt, I call her Grandma Grace, but she's really my aunt, but my sons call her Grandma Grace, came and talked about it, and then said, you know, in the very end, maybe that what your professor was talking about was this: hang on to your tradition. So she took me down to the waters, to this ceremony over the water, and told me what it was all about. Of course, I had heard that before, but I think when it catches you at that right time, you know, and the story is told in this particular way, and it's demonstrated with, you know, using these medicines and this language, it's very profound. You know, and again, it's not my story. I was just lucky enough to be there to kind of say what she said. So I think that's what we try to do with the book.
So I'm wondering, as I'm listening, where do these stories, where does developing a relationship with water fit into social work? And I'm trying to imagine, I've recently been reading Robin Kimmerer's work, who, you know, makes a challenge for us to not just learn from water, but give and be of service to. And I'm wondering, what would social work look like if it is not just taking care of water, but also offering to support the water? I don't know, does that fit into social work, Michael and Kris? Where do you see the potential for our training? Because I work with many social work students who are eager to learn, but also are anxious about getting a job. And our capitalist system, as you were saying, Kris, you were holding these workshops and not taking money, as I imagine, as a defense to protect the space from capitalist interests. And maybe I don't want to be too cynical, but help me understand, where might be some promising ways this can be integrated, or are there some things that should not be integrated into Western social work?
Well, perhaps you have, you know, in terms of work, like maybe going even outside of the technical role of a social worker. I come from an area where the water is very polluted, where the air is very polluted. I don't live there anymore, but in the Central Valley. So I think a lot of people have turned a lot of people have turned activism to issues of land use, fighting for environmental justice is a very important way. But I think you're right. It's not enough to play defense. There has to be something more than just trying to fight the relentless trek of capitalism. It's and that's with this book. We wrote this book also as a for discussion in community. That's why there's questions at the end to try to. I don't think either one of us would claim to have all the answers, but to try to provoke people in different places to discuss. And in our last chapter, that's why it's about futurity, about, we know what has to happen for us to survive as a species on this planet. So the question I think we have now is like, how do we do that? How do we find these ways? And I think everywhere in the world, people are scrambling to try to find what are these ways.
To add to that too, I think I know a little bit about Jane's work in trauma, and I think it's the same. The story that I told about how my son's grandfather had healed my son in the ground. He's saying that trauma can extend itself to all these things that we don't think are alive. Mm-hmm. And so when he did the ceremony, when my son got thrown from the horse, there's a ceremony we do back on the plains, right? So he did the ceremony with my son, and then I thought, okay, he's done. No, so we got to go do the horse now. So then he did the horse, and we were, waiting there. So okay, now he's done. We're going to give him these gifts, and there's nope, we're not done. So then he had to do the ceremony over where the incident happened, to the leaves, the trees, and my colonized mind, I'm like, oh, when's he going to get done? But then of course, I had grown up with that, so my mind was kind of fighting back and forth. And I said, okay, this is exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about we don't take our time, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you ask about that, what can social work do? I think social work really has to take that very seriously about their curriculum, right? There should be a strong curriculum in land-based, water-based education. I mean, that's got to be the centerpiece, I think, of any kind of social work program, because we're in such a state that we've grown so far away from the land and the water that now we live in this very, very precarious place. We're at the margins, of what ecologists call overshoot and collapse. We overshot the Earth's capacity to take care of us because we've polluted it so much and we've destroyed it so much that we're in a state of collapse. And that's what we talk about, in this book, is that if we can continue to do the things we continue to do as social workers, we're not going to get it. So we know water's a healer. We know water's a healer. Just like I just had a conversation with a bunch of mindfulness people just a few days ago talking about forest therapy or forest bathing. And I listened, I said, this is Japanese, and guess what? It's good for you to be out in nature, right? There's evidence base for it now. I'm like, and I sat there, I had a hard time holding my tongue, but then I said, listen, this is what Indigenous people have been saying forever. It's important to be out there. This was the whole colonization process, the colonization of your movement and your ability to be out there where you belong, out in nature, out on the land, in the water, in the mountains, in the desert, on the plains, in the Arctic, wherever your people are from. And I think that's what that's not taught. It's like the Rwandans, after the Rwandan genocide, all these Western mental health counselors went to Rwanda, and the Rwandan villages throw these people out. They threw them out because they said, all these Westerners want to do is they want to take us into these dark, dingy rooms and talk to us for hours about what happened, and we believe that you can cast trauma out of your body, just like you can cast out an evil spirit. And you do that by dancing, by singing, being outside in the sun. So we had to send these Westerners away because they don't know how to heal. So that's a very famous story, that we have to remember that's what's happening with social work. Social work has lost its connection, maybe never had a connection really to the earth, right? We started on the streets in an urban area, Whereas Indigenous people, social work started on the land, on the waters, in the mountains. So, and so I think that's the difference. If you can get Western social work to begin to shift their paradigm toward a more Indigenous orientation, then maybe there's a chance,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the stories in the book is about, I went up to Sami territory here once and spent a few weeks with Sami social workers. And they had a group of men who had issues with alcohol. And there's a beautiful clinic, maybe, I don't know, 6 hours away by bus, the top state-of-the-art, great clinic. When they send people there, they come back, they relapse pretty quickly. So these two Sami women created what they call in Finnish metsätherapia, so forest therapy, but a different kind of focus. They took these guys out on a canoe out on an island to do things like they would do traditionally with Sami people, hunting, fishing, reconnecting back to roots, speaking Sami, doing the things that were kind of not banned, but difficult to do because capitalism had come and it was hard to be a reindeer herder the way it was in previous generations. So way of life had been kind of squashed. And you know what? They had a much better rate of people staying sober and doing well than the people who went to the beautiful clinic. And this was low tech. The women went and, this was very basic stuff. They went and stayed in an average cottage. So it's not always like data-driven, high-tech, all this kind of stuff. It's sometimes just going back to recognizing your roots. It also connects people not only with the earth, but with each other. And that's what you need. I mean, addiction is a disease of disconnection, right? And, this was just the best medicine in a way.
The same is true about there's really interesting research that went on with Aboriginal people in Australia. Went out to the outback. They were suffering from all these chronic diseases, morbidities from hypertension and alcohol abuse and heart disease and high blood pressure, all these things. Put them out, and it's you can find it, the research. Put them out in the bush for a few weeks. All those markers went down, and they started thriving and doing better. So this is the thing with Indigenous people. They were taken from their places of thriving, into places where, the body says decay. It's not like we were never equipped to have, treatment approaches or interventions for trauma. We did as Indigenous people, and we've had things that have been even more difficult than residential schools. Like climate change. Like, smallpox that wiped out my people. And how do we come back from that and not, get caught in this never-ending door of historical trauma? Well, we know now that it's not people, it's the system that has continued to perpetuate the trauma, and people can't get away from the trauma. In the past, people could do the ceremonies and they could heal all kinds of traumas, whatever those traumas were. They survived ice ages. They survived, droughts, famines, all those kinds of things. And they did it on the land. They did it with the resources and the connection, reconnecting people with the land, whether it was hot or cold environments, or whether it was, in certain very sacred places where people went to pray or went to fast or found meaning again and got back to their set point, who they were as Indigenous people. We don't do that now. All the sacred places have been plowed up and paved over, or they're now parks and you can't get in there, because they were taken away from Indigenous people and colonized in that way. So those are the things social workers could fight for, is for to restore those places for healing. So.
And I think I'm going to switch. I want to open the floor if folks want to write some questions in the chat. We can take one or two questions before we take a break. One of the things I was reflecting on as you all were speaking, one of the paradigm shifts for social work today, at least where I work, is to let go of the evidence-based practice as the only criteria to guide us forward. Because even though, Michael, you were saying there is emerging evidence on these like long-lasting Indigenous knowledges, like being in nature is healing, is not new, but now maybe there's no new science to show us how it enhances health and well-being, but it may require us to have faith to create land-based pedagogies, even without maybe scientific proof or evidence to show. I think that will be a huge paradigm shift for many programs. But I also was reflecting on before the pandemic, although it's hard to remember now, life before the pandemic. I was so grateful in witnessing and participating. There was incredible organizing happening across Turtle Island in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en community in particular, with Standing Rock, the kind of collective sharing of Indigenous knowledges. I just felt like I was partially witness to. And even this incredible youth whose name I don't recall, they were speaking in Toronto at a rally. They were having rallies every week. Like, this was incredible, the momentum amongst many young people, driven really by many young people, including Indigenous leaders. And this young person was inviting us to have a relationship with any tree. Mm-hmm. And it was great because those of us in an urban landscape, as you were saying, Michael, so much of the natural world has been devastated by human consumption. But they were suggesting, and I think it's been quite powerful, that just committing to one tree can be transformative. It can get us to a place. And this was just sitting with the tree 30 minutes a day, noticing, developing a relationship with it, caring for it. Maybe it's not a tree, maybe it's a bush, maybe it's a plant. But it could start somewhere small and hopefully grow. These are just some things I was reflecting, but I'd love to invite my colleague, Ashley. Perhaps you can let us know what questions have been coming up in the chat.
Yeah, we've had a lot of great feedback, a lot of validation about especially carrying knowledge and living in between different worlds. And so many of us are working towards the same solutions and the same goals, but where do we draw the line between appropriation and non-appropriation? And we hear a lot about adapting things towards an Indigenous framework. But what I hear a lot too is that there are Indigenous ways of knowing and research and of being. And so when will these be at the table at the same way instead of being adapted or modified for mainstream purposes? How do we move towards that as social workers?
Maybe I can help with that. I think we have to, what's important if you think about traditional people, I'm not talking about people that are 100 years old today, I'm talking about people that are probably about 400 or 500 or maybe 1,000 years old today that would be Indigenous people. When Rupalim mentioned Cahokia, if you know of what Cahokia is, Cahokia was a trade center, it was a crossroads of Indigenous people. So Indigenous people we know now, from Cahokia to the Medicine Wheel in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, Indigenous people have been congregating and gathering and sharing ideas, ceremonies, technologies, material, ideas, whatever. And they've always done that, I think, with one another, because many believed that, of course, it would help their society. So I think that's the thing, is that it's important. I think there are some things, I think, that of Indigenous knowledge that non-Indigenous people can benefit from. Part of the problem is that sometimes when they get it, then they turn it into a commodity and start trying to sell it. And that's where the bad part happens. So sharing information, I think, is really important. It's really difficult. I mean, people have these profound changes when they do forest bathing, when they go out, like Rupalim was talking about, where they go out and sit with a tree or a plant. We know why, from neuroscience, we know why from a spiritual point of view. One of the things that happens with people when they're around trees for a long time, their brain begins to conform neural pathways with the connection of the shape of the trees, the smell of the trees, all these systems all work together. Then we know Like with my tribal people way back in the day, when they used to sing to a tree that represented a mother or grandmother for long periods of time, what happened in their brain was the parietal lobe in the brain got quiet. There was no longer this space between the tree and them. They became the tree became them. They became the roots, the bark, the leaves, the smell. We know how that works in neuroscience today. We know that's why Indigenous people done that. And we know that's why all people have done that to find a level of transcendence of being human being, to connect with the other part of the world. I mean, all the great spiritual leaders have done that. So that's not a secret. It's just that it's a long path to doing that. People have just taken that and commodified it on a weekend and said, let's go we're going to have this thing with the tree, and then you're going to feel better about that. It's going to cost you $5,000 a piece to do that, right? So people are hungry for that spirituality, very hungry for it. So it's that idea, like, you know, that happened in the 90s. You know, in the 90s, people were calling a lot of Indigenous people plastic medicine men because they were sharing a lot of our ceremonies. I don't know, most of you probably don't even remember that. You're probably not even born then, but that in the 90s, that's what was going on, you know, and there people were writing a lot of articles about that. But then there were some spiritual leaders said, no, this is a good thing. You know, this is our younger brother, our younger sister. We have to teach them. If they don't know this, how are they ever going to learn, right? And so I think that's where the history of all this comes from. I think it needs to be looked at in a really large kind of way to kind of find out if you teach people something sacred about the land, you know, are we going to be better off or worse off about that? That's the question. So I don't have an answer, but I'm just saying that's, you know, this is what people have said.
Hi, we're really excited today to introduce two of our graduates of the Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency Program at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. And we're moving now towards a lot of what Michael and Chris were talking about, a conceptual level, and what this means, you know, at a molecular level, and, you know, within inside of ourselves and our spirits. And this also has the realities of working on the front lines, and also what this means when we're working with our families who are working through these systems that have been ingrained and infused through colonialism, and how do we position ourselves and work both within, alongside, and to better the experiences we have in life. So maybe we haven't talked about this. Lisa, I'd like to start with you. If you'd like to just introduce yourselves, talk a bit about yourselves and your work.
Good morning, everyone. Lisa Robinson. I'm speaking to you from the west coast of Vancouver Island, Nuu-chah-nulth territory. And I'm from the Heshquit First Nation, married into a Howzit. But I just want to start by thanking Rupalim for inviting us to this forum, and also the previous speakers and my mentor, Jane Middelton-Moz, and all of you that are tapping in to bring our energies together to see how we're going to move forward. I really appreciate the work that was done with this book with Chris, Clarke, and Michael, because I believe everybody has a part to play. I don't know how to write books, but like I know everybody has a piece of the puzzle here to help, you know, bringing us back together and helping us to live together peacefully. And so I just really want to appreciate everybody today, because we are in a tough time right now, trying to get through this pandemic. Like we had hit a record high again in BC, 1,300 cases. We're not out of this by not even close, I don't think right now. So I just want to just say that it's been challenging, but we've been able to get through. I just want to say I graduated from the program through the first cohort with Jermaine and other students. I graduated in 2018 and hit the ground running, right? Using everything that I was able to learn from the ITR program. It was really challenging, and Jermaine could probably support this, that all we ever heard through the whole 2 years was, we need to clean our basements out, in order to be able to, do that, in order to help people, we need to be clear, and yeah, and I'm also, I guess, wanting to really share, that I am a residential school survivor. I was in one of the last schools that was open, that is now in Tofino, and there was a residential school where they've now put a Best Western there. And when I was listening to, talking about the environment and whatnot, I was in probably one of the most magical places that you could ever imagine, but I was going through hell, as a child. And so all that pain, I didn't have a voice, lost my voice then. And it was really hard to, make any sense of anything at all, and including appreciating the environment I was in. I couldn't connect because I disconnected from the pain that I endured as a child. And so I think it's important, I really want to acknowledge everybody. I think I know we as First Nations people are going to lead somehow. I know that, I feel it, because I believe that we're still really closely connected to those values that we lived by. I was mentored by elders who actually lived in longhouses on the West Coast, and they lived in harmony together. They lived by their values of taking care of one another, sharing, respect. We have our own word for that, which is Isak. We made sure everybody was included in everything. One of our words that we use that talks about, how we're all one is Hishuk Ish Tsawak, which means we're all connected. And what you do to one thing is going to affect everything else. So I really learned to wake those values up as I worked through my own trauma and found my voice, healing from those things that happened to me. And I know it all comes from the historical trauma, the colonization, those words that I didn't know when I was growing up, but I knew I wasn't being treated right, And I think what was the hardest part was it was my own family and community that was treating me this way. And I didn't understand that. So I appreciate people that have looked up and kind of put it all together, how colonization has affected us, but I think right now we're really in a crisis, and we need to kind of get moving now. And I always feel that kind of urgency, and when I went to get my schooling, I only went to grade 7 because I got kicked out of residential school because I was so bad. I was really a bad kid, according to them, right? But I was just surviving. And so I didn't pursue any education, but I always wondered, how come our communities are like this? How come we're like this? And so, you know, and I didn't think I was smart either in the sense of going to an academic institution. I didn't know, but then I start working through some of my pain, and it's like I realized, oh yeah, I guess I am smart. You know, I even got into law school. I didn't choose that, but I ended up on another path. And so it's been quite a journey, you know, like and I guess because of those values that I was raised with for the beginning part of my life, which I now know attachment is really, really the main thing, right? You need to attach to people and feel that love from someone. And I guess I was lucky because I had my grandparents, you know, and they kept me shielded for the first part of my life, so then I could survive the rest of what I needed to go through. But in that process, I understood values, and of course disconnected from them when I was going through all that pain, but it was not hard to wake it up again once I got through the pain, you know. And so I really work hard every day to live by those values. It guides everything that I'm doing. And so I guess I'll say a little bit about what I'm doing now. There's lots going on. I'm really tired because I work so much, but I work at a family treatment center, Cots Common Family Development Center. You can look it up, and we have a video on there. It'll tell you all about what we do. Work with the whole family system on all of their issues. In the last 10 years, we've been the last stop for many families who say, if you don't go here, we're going to take your children away. So we work really hard to work with these families, and for the most part are successful because most of them have lost their voices too. So it's about helping them to find their voice. And as Jane was saying in the beginning, it's like, it's not what's wrong with you, what happened to you, you know. And so we need a lot more of this kind of work happening because, you know, far too often families are being taken apart still. It's still going on. So we use the model that Jane kind of helped us to understand, you know, in connecting our family and community. We don't just work with the family system, we also work with the outer circle, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our aunties, our uncles. We bring them in also to, you know, work on their traumas and, you know, help them to connect back to themselves so they can connect with their families. And then more recently, the last couple of years, we've been having intergenerational healing gatherings where we have up to 4 generations of residential school survivors and helping them to finally connect, because so many of them haven't spoken, you know, because of the pain that they've endured. And so it's been really valuable, and Jane's mentoring us still as a center. We often call on her when we have some difficult things happening here. And as I was saying, through the pandemic's really difficult. Every week we have word of many more people passing away, not from the pandemic, but from addictions and violence, premature death. So that's getting really tiring. Like I could almost cry about it because I'm so tired, right? And like we can't do enough right now to bring people in. So the last thing I want to talk about and what we're doing in our work here is we started to see the need for helping people to deal with sexual abuse and sexual assault. So for the last couple years, we've been building that foundation to help offenders, victims, and their families to heal from this, because it's such an epidemic in our communities that we need to have places for people to go to heal, you know, and do that deep work. So we're finally at the stage now where we're building our strategic plan and starting to look for funds, you know, to pull this together. And it, believe me, it's not easy either. Like it's a challenge, but you know, I've sort of realized that this is probably the thing I'm going to do till I pass over to the spirit world, is make sure that there's help for people, because that's the open wound that was left. And you know, one of the jobs that I did is I worked for the residential school settlement agreement, and I was a resolution health support worker, and I'd have to go into the hearings with our grandmothers and, you know, parents and listen to their stories, be a witness. So I listened to over 100 stories, and I had to just sit there and listen. And it actually took me out of the game for a while because I couldn't do it anymore. It was so horrible, so horrific. I just, you know, but now I kind of know why. Like, it's starting to make sense that I had to hear those stories. I had to understand what happened to our parents and our grandparents, and then how it passed on. And so then we can, as I move forward in the work I'm doing, I have that compassionate way of going forward with this, like that this is a learned thing. One thing I wanted to say, you know, there's all this, you know, people talk lots now about it has to be our way, like our traditional way. And you know, when I was going away to university, I went and talked to some of our elders, and one of them said to me, he said, when we had problems in our communities, like when we couldn't solve it, we couldn't, you know, find a path, we would send people out to other communities to see if they had a solution. How do we solve this, you know? And so in a way, he was telling me, it's okay, go and learn. And so I was so grateful to start to understand some of this other work that's happening. It's amazing what they can see with the brain now, and how trauma actually affects the brain. And like, you're not a flawed person, this is just your brain surviving, you know. So all of that information, all of that like work by Jane, by Bessel van der Kolk, all these great people that are in the field helping all of us to understand how we're affected when we're not treated or properly when we're growing up, has been amazing, you know. And when I share some of that information with our young families, I've been in here this last week helping with the trauma week, and you could see the relief on people, because up until that point, they think there's something really wrong with them, you know, and there isn't, right? They just need to learn, you know, how to find that voice. And the other thing I guess I would say is I agree, though, that all the work that we do here is based, you know, in the territory we're in the Channel territory, where we use some of our teachings, our medicine, but we also, because of our teaching of sharing and being inclusive, we welcome others, you know, to share what they do. And what I found interesting in the MSW program was so many other Indigenous nations, and Germaine could probably agree, is that, you know, when we did our ceremonies at the end and we presented to one another how much in common we have, you know, like, and how those values are so strong, you know, like, and yeah, some of us are farther away from that root, but you know, that connection to land is just as powerful in Scotland as over here, you know, like that belief in the medicines. And, you know, I just found that really powerful, and it seemed like we all come together and people could express themselves with their value system. And yeah, I don't know what else I can say. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Lisa. And you've touched on so many important points, especially what it's like really struggling, right, for these resources and putting our families on the front line, and the toll it takes on us. And what does this mean? What does this mean to live in this and also work in it? It's a real struggle, and with so few of us. So that's where we're talking, right, about building the capacity and the healing, the importance of healing and having our people and our strength. So I really appreciate you sharing more of your personal story, because that's really what we need to more be, being personal and being human with each other, sharing that humanity, and that, you know, this is, yeah, our shared history, and this is where we're at. This is our current reality, as painful and as beautiful as it may be. This is where we're at in all of those things. And I know that yourself and Jermaine have worked closely throughout this program. And so with a little bit of time, and you've mentioned the work, Jermaine, would you like to share with us a bit about yourself, and also how you're working on these front lines?
Miigwech. I'll introduce myself formally. Sakajuwea Pinesi Kwaidishnikasid, Ginabajing Donjaba, Giku Dodem, Anishinaabe Kwayandao. And so my name is Jermaine Elliott, and I'm from the Serpent River First Nation. I come from the Fish Clan, and I'm part of the mighty Anishinaabe Nation. So I want to thank all of the speakers before me, who spoke before me, and I want to acknowledge one of my teachers, Jane Middelton-Moz, and my colleague, Lisa Robinson. So she inspired me throughout our 2-year tenure as students at the MSW program at U of T. And we were part of the first cohort for the Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency program. And I went back to school at a very, I would say, late age in my life. But when I seen this program, I just knew that I had to be there. And I did something that I would normally not do, which was jump through a lot of hoops and complete a lot of paperwork to get into this program, because I felt that strongly, that there was something relevant, something unique, and something that would help give the tools for a journey that I didn't even know that I was starting on, but it just seemed right at the time. So I come from a small community in Northern Ontario. I live currently in Orillia, Ontario, and my responsibilities here in Orillia is to guide and provide some, I guess, a bit of oversight to an Indigenous primary healthcare team. And it's a new team, so we're in our 3rd year of operation. But the community that I come from is a small community where everyone is related and everyone knows each other. And it's been one of the blessings in my life to have lived in my own community and to have spent my early years with grandparents. And so a lot of the discussion earlier about, you know, Indigenous ways of being and knowing, that really resonates with me. Like, you know, I was listening to the discussions about how people want to be able to, you know, be in the presence of nature and to learn from that and to feel the beauty of that relationship. And so when I grew up, it was, you know, like I could see how my grandparents were and how they lived their life. but it was in such attunement, not just my grandparents, but like everybody in my community. They're so attuned with the world around them. My grandfather could go out in the morning and know if that was a good day to go hunt rabbits or not, right? And know, my grandmother knew when it was time to plant and when it was, time. It was just so, everything was so balanced. And so I think that was a blessing for me as an individual. But also, I grew up in a time when we did not have social services or programs, right? They were non-existent. And I didn't really think about that until I went back to school. And I was working with other students, and I didn't really give that much thought to social work, even though I'd been in a helping capacity all of my life. But why I'm mentioning it here is because I think that that when people turn to social work, as a career or as a helping profession, it's important to remember that in going into communities, it's never to replace the structures that are already there, right? And so when I think about my role as a helper in any community, it is just that, to look carefully, to listen carefully to the community, to find out where that support and help could be brought in, but not to tell people what they need, right? Or to place outside values on what might be important to a community or a family, right? I didn't realize that till I had actually gone back to school, because a lot of the discussion was around, with some of my colleagues, were around services, right? Well, we need more services for this, or we need a more programming for that. And I'm not saying that that's not true, but I think we also need to look at those natural systems that exist within communities and find ways to strengthen those systems, right? So much like someone had talked about, and this really resonated with me as well, when we were having a crisis of suicides in the northern communities, or northern First Nations, the first response is to send in counselors or psychologists, who were flown into the community, and then they might stay 2 or 3 weeks and then they leave, right? And that has always been the typical response, at least here in Ontario. And that has never really been very helpful, in my opinion, to the community. It did little to work with the community structures as a whole so that the community could reclaim those natural helpers within the community that could help, that could remember how to care deeply for each other, right? And this is one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that Jane is doing, because it recognizes the need to include whole communities, and also acknowledging the work that Lisa is doing out there in her community. So I just wanted to share that with you. My work right now is in the healthcare, and the healthcare system has got to be one of the most racist systems. I'm tempted to say ever, but I don't want to say ever. But it is a very challenging system to work in, because the views there are so entrenched, and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practices are are not often respected or acknowledged. So it's a continual struggle to make space. So, Jane had mentioned about, building bridges. And so I do a lot of that. I do a lot of building bridges, but I also walk a tightrope between understanding and listening to the needs of our community and having to balance all of the pressures of meeting the obligations and reporting requirements of a healthcare system. And the policies are in the hundreds, right, that we have to manage on a daily basis. But I'm really happy with the work that we do here because we are recognized as an Indigenous team. So we have been given more space than would be typically given. And so we've been able to occupy that space and make more space so that traditional healing practices are incorporated into everything that we do. We also provide a lot of land-based activities, and just recently have started an equine assisted learning program, so working with horses to help our community members, because everybody's so traumatized by the impact of COVID, by the isolation and the disconnect, which is having a really unhealthy impact on the communities, but also as workers, like as helpers, natural helpers in our community. It's also had an impact on us. So that's a little bit about the work that I do. I have the honor and privilege of working with a fabulous team of really culturally grounded social workers and therapists. And it's a bit of a challenge in working with the clinical team, like the nurse practitioners and the physician, because I think they have to continue to work really hard to accept that Indigenous knowledge is equal to the knowledge that they hold in terms of, Western clinical practices. But we're getting there, so it's a work in progress. So I think that's all that I wanted to share for now, in case there's questions. So again, thank you for this opportunity. Like I'm always so nervous because it's a really big deal, right? To speak here on this panel. So miigwech.
And we have another question and moving forward, but Jermaine, just briefly, there's a question here about if you think loneliness and isolation is the cause of despair leading to suicide that you mentioned among your community members.
Well, I'd say loneliness and isolation are part of it. Jane is often says that connection is the correction. And I think that there is, as human beings, like there is absolutely a need for us to be connected with each other, so that when we do find ourselves isolated and disconnected, that has a lot of consequences in terms of not just physical health, but mental and spiritual health as well.
Thank you, Jermaine. And before we move on to reflections about the day, Lisa, would you mind just speaking briefly about what you see are the ways of moving forward in terms of waking up Indigenous memory?
I really do, I guess it's my own belief, but I do believe that, those frozen, like if someone has lived through trauma, like I have layers of trauma, it seems like, and this is just my own, I can't speak for everybody else, but my own feeling is the more layers that are kind of, deactivated, the more human, I feel, where like it's like you feel more I guess connected to your spirit. I don't know what it is, like it's and I think that goes for every human being, right? Like we're not the only ones that have trauma, you know, like it's around the world. But my understanding, my own experience is the more layers I have kind of taken off, it's like we naturally go back to that state of, you know, that kindness is really strong. And especially if we've been through a lot, my compassion has grown, you know, tenfold, because I have compassion for myself, you know, and that little girl that got herself kicked out and kicked out of the residential school. And I was so angry, you know, like, I just love people that are like that now, because I think, wow, you're making it. And so I believe that, like, our people, it doesn't, the ones that come here anyway, the families that we work with, is like, seriously, you see the transformation as they find their voice and as they find that compassion for themselves, and they in turn, you know, like, are able to connect with their children without that shame, right? And that attachment gets really strong, right? So the attachment is number one, right? Like, and we know it got broken in residential school. It's, of course, people always ask me, been doing a lot of interviews lately. I don't know why people are asking my opinion, but I'm like, okay, why don't you guys just really, really, really try to understand the residential school? Like, think about it. Think about what happened, right? Like, think of your own kids, think of your grandchildren, think of what if they took them away? What if they took them away from the source of love, right? Not for one generation, but a few. What do you think is going to happen? And then what do you need to do to repair that? You know, how do we need to reconnect and reattach to people, you know? And so, of course, we have lots of complications from it, but like, it's understandable. I don't think anybody should even be wondering what's happening with us, because look at what happened, you know, generations, you know, and we're just trying to rebuild that connection. And I actually thought I had no hope. I was thinking, oh no, when I learned about what happens when you're disconnected from your family, you're neglected, you're not treated well, and then that doesn't help develop your brain very well, you know, like your prefrontal cortex doesn't get that strong to be able to handle stress. And I was like, oh no, like, I had it pretty rough, so I don't know if I'll have a chance to be healthy. But then we know from these neuroscientists that are studying trauma that that part of our brain's always growing, you know, through attachment, through connection, through love, you know. So all these people in my life, and even you, have helped all those pathways get stronger, right? So we all have hope, you know, we all can heal. That's the amazing thing about us, you know. So I think I'll leave it at that.
So it's time for us to move to reflection. So Lisa, those were just incredible words. And Jermaine, thank you both. Really the heartfelt way in which you share the work you're doing and what has brought you here, and even the neuroscience, Lisa, that you brought in to help us imagine the many pathways that allow us to heal. I'm going to invite Michael and Kris back for just a kind of very quick reflection. The reflection that I took from the book, and Kris actually reminded me to look at this. This is from an African proverb, so I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm going to get the grammar wrong, so I'm going to try to read it. So this is a way of thinking about the future. That which will have had to happen. That which will have had to happen. And I know there are many communities that are thinking about the future and encouraging us to dream beyond what we think is currently possible. And I think Lisa's words of hope really take us there as well. So Kris and Michael, would love to give you a minute to just give us a reflection in closing to take away today. Kris, if you'd like to start.
Well, first, again, I'd like to say how honored I am to be among all of you, and thank you for sharing your stories. They really do mean a lot, and they really validate so much of this path I've walked, learning from Michael and thinking about these issues. And I really think, what you highlighted, especially Lisa, about connection and kindness is really important. So much of the evidence-based techniques were learned in the data colonization, colonialism of slicing and dicing people into a million different items of information takes so much away from us as human beings and makes us lose perspective of what we really should be doing. And social workers are about much more than just random slices of data that we've put into a computer that would generate, decision A or decision B. And I think we need to reassert, what this is all about. Social work is not a new thing. People have done this for millions of years. It's not something that was invented with colonialism. Societies knew how to care for themselves, and in many ways much better than the disassociated ways that we've learned. And maybe the challenge for us is that which must have happened for us to survive. And the way of doing that is going back and learning without appropriating from societies that have, survived and been so resilient for so long, being humble.
And Michael, did you want to share a few reflections?
Yeah, I first of all, again, just like Kris said, thank you to everyone for your presence, for the questions, and especially to you and all the other organizers. It's a really wonderful event. Really learned so much listening to everyone and looking at the questions too as well. So I think one of the things I've been thinking about is how social work is or has become like the social work or the social services industrial complex, right? It's really kind of what it is. It's, when I think about it, it's that, social work in ourselves has convinced ourselves or convinced policymakers and the rest of the world that we need social work in order for everyone to get healthy and healed. Well, the truth is we need a healthy planet. We need healthy relationships. We need healthy water. We need healthy ways to learn and to embrace and to one another. And that's one of the messages of the book, is that if we're going to move towards an integrative healing in social work, we really have to think about how all of these things that not just us in the book, but everyone's talking about in terms of the health of our planet, it really doesn't matter, a whole lot. I mean, from the here and now, unless the comet hits us or the Earth core cracks, and aliens come flying out of there, we're going to survive for at least a generation or two. But, the wisdom of the seventh generation, I think we're responsible for that. We're a very important link to that in what we do and what we teach and how we live our lives. And so, it gets down to when we talked about water, water now is like plastic soup, the ocean. Every piece of fish that you eat, every shellfish that you eat, you're eating micrograms of plastic, right? So this is something we have to be aware of, even though we don't see it. Just like the brain, like Lisa was talking about, I like to look at the brain myself. We don't see trauma on the outside or manifested in our telomeres at the end of our chromosomes or these areas. Trauma in the earth is there, it's pretty clear, and it's human caused. Just like we've caused trauma to one another, we've caused trauma to the earth. And I think in order to move towards this integrative decolonized pathway, it's really important to look at that. It's not just about us. It's about, where we live and who we live with and how we live. So I think it's such an important thing to think about, whether or not we can continue to support a social work industrial complex the way it is, or whether or not we need to break away from that and begin to integrate some of the ideas that we all know that work, like getting back to the land and cleaning up the land, having zero waste, as a goal, and bringing down, CO2 levels by walking more, doing these kinds of things. Social work could be working, toward that kind of thing, rather than getting stuck in the primordial wheel of, dependency upon a public system that we are social workers, to say, rather than let's bring canned foods to people on the holidays that are made from these GMOs, these corporate worlds that have inside lining of BPA that are endocrine disruptors. Why aren't we engaged in social work that helps make edible landscapes, or puts in gardens, or help people return to the land? That to me seems to be, an integrative pathway towards healing. And I think that that's something very important to think about. So
much more. And I think what I love is how both very simple this can be, and the complexity that can be wrapped around it at the same time. So I thank you all for joining in this virtual space. I hope the rest of your day is maybe outside a little bit, given everything we've talked about, maybe not as much on the screen. I know there's so many more conversations, so if you can scroll back in the chat, I, with permission, took the last chapter from Chris and Michael's book, which is a discussion guide. For those who don't have access to the book, you can use this. They're really great questions, even if you haven't read the book. So you might have to scroll up on the chat. You can download the PDF. As with everything, there's so much more we can say. Thank you all for staying a few extra minutes. And it's my pleasure to invite back Chris Walser, I must be saying his name incorrectly, to send us off with a journey song.
It's been my pleasure and honor to be amongst each and every one of you. Some beautiful words, some beautiful teachings. In our Anishinaabe way, there is no word for goodbye. We always say "Bama pi gigwabmen," which means until we meet each other or see each other again. So this song says that, and it asks Creator to guide us home to our loved ones in a safe way. And thank Creator for gathering us all together here today. So. Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan. Hey ya hey ya hey hayo, hey ya hey ya hey hayo, hey ya hey ya hey hayo, hey ya hey ya hey hayo. Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan. Hey ya hey ya hey hayo, hey ya hey ya hey hayo, hey ya hey ya hey hayo. Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan, Bama pigi wa menan. Hey ya hey hayo, hey ya hey hayo. Way ya hey ya hey hayo, way ya hey hayo. Oh, Mama P.